Joining us now for our weekly economics and market talk from Oakland University is an assistant professor of management in their School of Business Administration. Professor Michael Greiner joins us now on the Megacast. Michael, thanks for being with us again.
It's great to be back. Happy snowy Friday.
Yes, very snowy Friday, a much longer commute for those going in this morning, and those going home, stay safe out there on the road as always. But what's the big impact right now, Michael, even beyond the snow outside in our pocketbooks continues to be inflation. At this moment in time, Michael, what is going on with inflation? And are we at a point where we could say potentially it's reached its peak?
Yeah, we actually got some good news about inflation last week, if you can believe it. I mean, after so many months of just relentless bad news, we finally saw some bright spots. And what it is we got news that for the second month in a row, the producer's price index has actually gone down. Now, the producer's price index, that basically tells you how much the producers, the manufacturers of goods, and the people who are producing different services are charging their wholesalers, like the retailers and that type of thing. It's not talking about how much consumers are paying, but essentially how much is being paid in the business-to-business transactions. And in that case, that can be a really good kind of long-term indication because of the fact that, you know, ultimately, those costs that are being paid by the middle people will be passed on to consumers. So, and in fact, we have seen a bit of a slowdown with the consumer's price index as well. So it seems like there's a lot of good evidence now that that inflation is finally starting to slow down. And that's really good news for everybody. That being said, the Fed has stepped in and said, well, don't get too excited. Because the problem that we've seen with the markets is every time they see a little bit of an indication that things might be getting better, they go crazy. And each time they've gotten disappointed when the Fed ends up having another big rate increase. So we saw one of the governors of the Federal Reserve Board, his name's Christopher Waller, say, hey, don't get too enthusiastic too fast. Although he was predicting that this time in their December meeting, they'll probably only be increasing rates by 0.5 percentage point, which is actually quite a bit slower than they've been doing the last 6 times they've raised interest rates by 0.75% increase. So this really seems to be indicating that maybe we're starting to come to the end of this crisis. Good news for everybody, I think. Frankly, I think that it's the type of thing that maybe we might be finally starting to get a breath of fresh air in that regard.
Well, Michael, we are, I've been told, we're having some technical issues at Master Control. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a very brief break. We'll come back and we'll continue on with this conversation in just a moment. You're watching and listening to the Megacast. Continuing on, Michael, while inflation continues to be combated through several severe measures here in the U.S., particularly the rising of the interest rate so far 6 times in the UK, inflation now at a 41-year high as recession over there is looming. And that's a market that's closely connected to the U.S. They're a close ally of ours. And we've talked about that before, about the messiness in the United Kingdom. How could a recession there indicate potential forecasts for the future here in the U.S., given the impact inflation's having on our economy?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're kind of in a different situation because right now all of Europe is really grappling with the fact that they've got major problems with the energy supply as a result of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. Now, that has impacted the global price of energy, but here in the United States, we're kind of protected from that a little bit simply because of the fact that we're a huge energy producer, and our number one source of imported energy is, frankly, Canada, who's not going to be really impacted by the invasion of Ukraine either. So we're in much better shape here in the United States than they are in Europe. In Europe, though, they're really in trouble. They're facing potentially a cold winter with rapidly increasing energy costs. And in fact, the irony is that the inflation in England would have been much, much worse had it not been for the fact that the British already announced that there's going to be a cap on the price of energy that's basically being enforced by the government. So were it not for that, you'd actually be seeing a much larger increase in inflation in the UK. In the United States, though, as I say, it seems like we've got a lot of good indications. You know, many of the supply chain issues seem to have really been resolved. It seems like The economy is slowing down just a little bit, hopefully just enough that we're starting to see inflation go down. Stores now do seem to have a lot of inventory. So that means that there's going to be less upward pressure as people compete to get the few goods that are available on the shelves. So my hope is that we'll be able to avoid it hurting us too much, but you just can't escape these things flowing over from one country to the next anywhere in the world, given how interconnected our economy is, and especially between here in the United States and the UK and Europe. So my guess is we're going to see a pretty severe recession potentially in the UK. We're also going to see a recession, my guess is, in Europe, hopefully not quite as severe as in the UK. But you have to remember, especially since the UK left the European Union as a result of Brexit, it's actually a relatively small economy on the global scale. So although it's major trading partner, or at least one of its major trading partners is the United States, for us, it's still a relatively small trading partner. So the hope is that their economic problems really won't flow over and impact us too severely, although it's inevitable that there will be some impact.
We're joined by Michael Greiner on today's edition of the Megacast from Oakland University for our weekly market talk. And as we talk about where the U.S. goes in terms of battling inflation, where our economy is at, that also heavily impacts the United States and their debt. And with the results of the election being what they were just a little over a week ago, now we are in a state of divided government in Washington, with the House of Representatives going back to the Republican Party, the Senate as of now remaining in Democratic power, and of course the White House also in Democratic power. But that also means an impact could be seen on the debt ceiling here in the U.S., and that can also have some significant not just political impacts, but economic impacts. How is the Biden administration, this Treasury Department, considering that in the future, and what measures they may be able to take if the House of Representatives, with its Republican majority next year, refuses to raise the debt ceiling or is using that as a political tool?
Yeah, I got to tell you, this is something that really outrages me, and frankly outrages most economists, and even for that matter, most business people. Because the reality is that when we're talking about the debt ceiling, up until about 20 years ago or so, this was just a no big deal issue where the debt ceiling would be kind of raised as a matter of course on a bipartisan basis. Nobody ever really made a big deal about it. And about 20 years ago, it started to kind of become a political football. I'm not going to cast aspersions at one party or the other. There's probably plenty of blame to go around. But the bottom line is that certainly it has become a political football. And back in 2011, actually, there became such a big battle over it that we endured a government shutdown, of course. Many people have probably remembered a number of these government shutdowns. And Standard & Poor's actually lowered the rating for the United States debt that gets issued. Now, to most people, when you think of debt, you think, going to the bank. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about bonds. When you think of savings bonds or treasury bonds, those are basically debts that are issued by the United States government to fund either large investments or to fund its operations. And the reality is that really we've been going deeper and deeper into debt since about the year 2000. And really, the increases in debt date back to about the year 1980. But the 1990s, for a variety of reasons, actually, we experienced a surplus in our budget. That's the last time we did so. So as a result of that, there was less debt that was accumulated. But certainly since about 2001 or so, the United States has been going deeper and deeper into debt. At some times we're going more quickly into debt, at sometimes less quickly into debt. But the bottom line is we've been increasing our debt because of the fact that we're spending money more quickly than it comes into the Treasury. Now, there are debates as to how critical this is and how much of a long-term issue this really is, because part of the advantage that the United States has in incurring debt is, number one, we have what's called the reserve currency in the dollar, which is that everybody in the world uses the dollar. wherever you are in the world, if you've got a United States dollar, it's basically accepted as currency on par value. So that's a real strength that the United States dollar has, contrary to most currencies, which, I'd challenge anybody to try to take a Japanese yen or a Russian ruble, for that matter, into a store here in the United States and try to use it. Probably wouldn't get very good result. But here, if you take a US dollar, literally anywhere in the world, you can use it on a par value basis. So that's a real advantage that the United States has. In fact, about 60% of our currency is actually located overseas because of the fact that it is so heavily relied upon as a foreign trade medium, essentially. And so that's one advantage that we have, that people always want dollars. And that's part of the reason, by the way, why the dollar right now is so strong relative to other currencies, and that it's kind of a currency that people feel is secure in this time of really a lot of uncertainty going on around in the world, with China having economic problems, with Europe having economic problems, with the UK, as we discussed, having economic problems, with Russia invading Ukraine and the ruble in big trouble, with there being big inflation, which really is not being managed very well in Turkey. So everybody around the world is looking for a safe haven for their investments, and they're seeing dollars as being that location. So that's a real advantage that we have. So number one, people are willing to accept dollars as payment for the debt. Number two, most debt around the world, including all of our debt, is denominated in dollars as a result of that. So essentially, we create the money that gets used to pay back the debts that we incur. Now, there is a risk with that, which of course we're dealing with right now, which is inflation, where people are always concerned that, if you print too much money, then it reduces the value of each dollar, and then you get into inflation. But the reality is we're quite a bit of a distance from that concern. And generally speaking, U.S. policymakers, including the Fed, where they set monetary policy, have been very conservative in terms of how we, quote unquote, print money. And really the tightening that we're dealing with right now is a great example of that. Finally, the fact is that, again, because of so much chaos going around in the world, people still want to buy U.S. debt. So we're able to sell it at a very low interest rate. And the U.S. economy, despite the issues we've been dealing with, continues to grow. And so as a result of the fact that it's growing, as long as the debt remains below a certain percentage of our gross domestic product, which it still is, then we essentially keep growing at a rate that we're basically outgrowing the amount of debt we have. Now, the concern is if that kind of reverses, then that could be an issue. But that's really not a major concern in the short run, at least. The bigger issue, though, is that if Congress can't get along well enough to at least pass these debt limit increases, which, as I say, used to be just a administrative process that was passed on a bipartisan basis with really no controversy at all, then we could see people maybe getting scared and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be investing in U.S. securities. And if that happens, then suddenly it could become much more expensive for America to borrow money, which means that we'll be spending more of our federal budget on just paying interest costs rather than paying back the actual debts that we owe or paying for ongoing expenses that the government has. That's one downside. And then the bigger downside, though, in some respects, is the fact that because of the fact that the US dollar is such a globally respected currency, as I say, it's the global reserve currency at this point, if the globe gets concerned about the viability of our dollar because of the fact that we're not paying our debts as we should be, then all of a sudden you could see literally a global catastrophe occur where you suddenly get into a situation where from one country to another, they don't know how to deal with trade because they can't rely upon that value of being able to go into a store anywhere in the world, show them a dollar, and get paid for it. So that really is the big concern: is are we going to be able to continue to have the dollar as the global reserve currency when you see such dysfunction going on in Congress? And my hope is that cooler heads will prevail, that they'll be able to get past this and not use this really very basic administrative procedure, which really all it represents is just paying the debts we've already incurred. These are things where we've already paid for them, and we just need to pay the debt. And if we can't continue to borrow the money to pay the debts, then all of a sudden we get ourselves into a government shutdown situation, and we endanger our currency. And these are really major, major concerns, which I think everybody across the country should be really concerned about.
Well, Michael, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us, as always, to talk about the state of the market, the state of our economy as we continue to deal with these issues in a variety of different ways, not just here in Michigan and in the U.S., but worldwide. Thank you very much.
Happy to be here. Have a happy Thanksgiving.